Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ProgCast. I'm your host, Gregg Bendian, and we discuss all forms of forward-looking music here on this podcast. And today's no exception. I'm very happy to be welcoming one of my favorite musicians, one of my favorite violinists, certainly uh, someone who I've been following since the 1970s with his incredible performances and recordings of some of the first recordings on Nonesuch uh, records of contemporary music that I heard as a high school student coming up as a studying and practicing musician. And he's been a champion of new music for, I think, going on about 50 years. And he's a passionate educator, passionate performer, a virtuosic performer. And I am so pleased to welcome violinist Rolf Schulte to the program. Hi, Rolf.
Hi, Greg. Good to see you.
Nice to see you.
Yeah.
Hey, I was wondering, I found it very interesting that in Germany, where you grew up, your dad was really your principal first teacher. Is that correct?
My first teacher, I wouldn't say principal, but he was an amateur violinist who I was just talking about it yesterday. Unfortunately, didn't get an instrument until he was 18 when he could afford to pay for it out of his own pocket. His parents got him a zither, of all things, when he expressed a wish to. But given all that, I have to say, he showed determination. He played in an amateur orchestra. And later on switched to oboe, which is one of the hardest instruments to master, just to get a note out of it. I tried, you squeeze and nothing comes out. So yeah, he supervised my practicing. And about 4 years or so later, I got a real teacher. Um, but we played duets and yeah,
So, what part of Germany?
in Cologne.
Cologne?
Cologne, which was oddly, as you know, a center of new music in the late 50s, early 60s. Really a hotbed of Stockhausen was there and Ligeti and Cage came often, Moderna, Henri Pousseur, Boulez came, the whole, what Milton Babbitt used to call the Darmstadt boys.
Well, they are. They're known
Yeah.
well. What was
Yeah.
that? Was that something that you were aware of growing up?
Sure, aware, but I didn't really follow it. I was too young. I mean, we knew these names and we heard this and that, but to tell you the truth, I was fairly anti-new music until about age 15, even. And then it was a Bartok quartet that we worked on that turned me around. And Bartok has been a very important figure in my life. There's a wonderful amalgamation of a very strong and lyrical personality, and at the same time an avant-garde, experimental nature. You know.
Oh yeah. I mean, we could talk about Bartok for the rest of the program.
Right, right. Yeah.
But do you remember which quartet it was?
Number two,
Number
yeah,
two. Wow.
which the experts call the most lyrical of the. And unfortunately, I've not played in quartets. I've played the third, and I fooled around with the fourth a little bit, but that's been the extent. But I play both violin sonatas and the concerto number one. Yeah.
What do you think is so important about those string quartets that we're still talking about them?
Well, they carry on the tradition of the late Beethoven quartets, like Schoenberg's quartets do too. And they, of course, explore the ethnic rhythms of the region from Serbia to Croatia to Hungary, Romania. He traveled very widely. It's very interesting. I mean, I'm fascinated by the movements, artistic movements. For instance, Paul Klee, who is a painter whom I adore, he similarly took travels to North Africa and all over that territory. Bartok got there too. He heard Moroccan music, Greek music. All these things had an influence. Um, he studied them diligently. He traveled over countryside with his little gramophone recorder, with the huge what do you call it, bell, um, and taped religiously everything. And then when he came home, he played all these things back and wrote them out. I mean, he was a real musicologist that way. And did you know that when he came to this country, Columbia University did not offer him a job as a composition teacher, but they gave him a studio to do his research, which
I
I
did know.
find
Yes, I did
pretty
know that.
appalling. You know, here's one of the major composers, and Columbia University can't offer him a professorship of composition. Maybe he wasn't interested. That is possible, but
Well, and he's a sort of a tragic figure because, as we know, he died quite poor in New York, and
right, right.
was not able to really to have, other people had to cover his funeral, and I just,
Yeah,
again, it sort of continues down the road to say, why did this happen?
yeah, yeah.
But those pieces
Well,
are huge.
it's a figure I look up to. For instance, he would, all his friends, and he had famous friends like Joseph Sigeti, for instance, or Kusevitsky, I guess Benny Goodman too. They all wanted to give him money, but he wouldn't accept it. He would only accept it if he could write a piece and work for it. I respect that so tremendously, you know.
Of course.
Yeah.
So you were doing basically classical music until you
Mhm.
got to America. Was there any
No,
contemporary music
no.
happening?
I came here when I was 18. And like I said before, at about 16, I started getting interested in, and the jump was pretty quick. It occurred to me, well, here we have people like Stockhausen and I tried to bridge the gap, so to speak, time-wise, from Bartok to, I'd played Stravinsky. I'd gone to the Munich competition, and my program there included the Webern pieces, Opus 7, which I still adore, the Stravinsky Duo Concerton, and the Bartok Second Sonata. But that was according to what they requested. Um, I guess they asked for one contemporary piece and either the Debussy or the Bartok Second, and I forget, maybe a Prokofiev Sonata to pick from. But yeah, by that time I was, pretty much sold. The funny thing is, when I came to this country, I had of American music only dabbled in John Cage and Feldman.
Which
Um,
pieces?
well, John Cage has these early six melodies.
Right.
That my only appearance in Carnegie Hall was when I played those six melodies, some of the quietest music ever written in the big hall. I played
Wow.
many times in Weil. Yeah, so I played some Cage and Feldman. There were Vertical Thoughts was one piece. They were all fairly short. Durations number 4 was another one. I forget the other titles. So then I come here to study at the Curtis Institute of Music, and which was fairly conservative. They didn't like. I mean, Rudolf Serkin, a wonderful musician who was the director, he nearly had a heart attack when we dared to play the Webern Symphony Opus 21.
Wow.
Um, and toward the end of my stay there, I played the Schoenberg Fantasy, and he was there, and he said this funny thing. He said, "I would have loved to have had Schoenberg teach theory here, not composition." I found that very interesting too. Yeah.
So
Anyway,
was
so and then I joined this ensemble called Speculum Musicae. You probably heard me play with them.
I did hear you with Speculum a few times, sure.
Yeah. And I was introduced to composers whose names I'd never heard before, like Charles Wuorinen, and even Carter, I didn't know by name even. Um, I guess, yeah, he was in Berlin in the mid 60s, but I wasn't aware of it. Yeah, and then I got to work with these great composers, and
Yes, you
I guess
did,
we're
and,
going
and
to,
that's definitely something I wanted to speak with you about
right,
because you have a long history with Mr. Carter.
right.
Um, I was curious about uh, how you felt the contemporary music was being received in Europe when you left to how it was being handled in America? If you could give a perspective on that.
Well, that's a little hard to compare because at the time that I left, I wasn't really doing avant-garde music in concert. But generally speaking, I mean, not only because I grew up in Cologne and all these people were active there, people were quite open to new music. I mean, you will always find people who hate new music with a vengeance, but and we had to struggle here too. I remember, certain concert venues were not very open to even Stravinsky, you know. Yeah. So in many ways, some of us like Fred Cherry and Ursula Oppens, all members in this group, and I'm sure you know them too.
I do.
We fought the battle. We were the trailblazers in many ways. Now, of course, it's changed. It's almost a given that. I remember talking with Lucy Shelton, who said, in our day we had to work very hard on a Pierrot Lunaire, and now she works with young groups, and they play it like it were Schumann or Beethoven.
It's really incredible. I see it too.
Yeah.
So,
Anyway.
what did you think of the sort of the open aspects or the aleatoric aspects of Feldman and Cage when you were first approaching that, especially coming from a straight classical background? Do you feel comfortable with that?
Well, there was very little. I mean, the one piece of Feldman's was somewhat, let's call it indeterminate. Um, I remember there was a piece called Durations that I mentioned before that had no notes. It had just blocks for high pitch, medium pitch, and low pitch. And I remember I recorded at the radio in Cologne after I'd come here and gone back, just to visit and to perform. Um, I recorded the one version improvised, really. You pick a pitch as you go along, and then I made a 12-tone version that we also recorded. Something I probably wouldn't do anymore now, but it never got to the composer. So I never met Morton Feldman in real life. Mm.
It's funny.
Page I actually performed with once up in Woodstock. There was
Oh,
this
really?
outfit called the Creative Music Studio.
I remember Carl Berger. Yeah.
Carl Berger, yeah. And John Cage came and we played, and he got very nervous to perform. I remember that. We basically played there's this very simple piano solo piece called Dream. Again, very early. And we somehow played it together at this place. It was sort of anybody could do anything. And I forget what the rest of the program was, whether it was my concert or just a mix of, many other composers presenting their works. Christian Wolff was there too. I've played some of his music. A lovely man, very cultured. Yeah.
So, I spoke to Ursula Oppens about this period within the last year, and the fact that you guys are coming into this really, it's an explosion of activity. There's interest. There are groups. You mentioned Speculum Musicae. My composition professor Jeffrey Kresge was a student of Wuorinen and also a one-time keyboardist in Speculum.
Right, the first year, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know what happened, why he was gone pretty much after a year. There were some other changes. For instance, the first double bass player was Jeffrey Levine. I don't know if you know him by name even. And then Donald Palmer replaced him. And
for the rest of the time.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I remember the classic lineup. And I remember the first performances of a lot of those pieces. Jeff had turned us on to a lot of different contemporary classical. All of our libraries, I was in Teaneck, New Jersey, our library had all of the Nonsuch recordings, and we listened to them religiously. with
Yeah.
scores when we could get them. But I have to tell you, one of my all-time favorite recordings of yours is the Wuorinen String Trio,
String tree.
which you did with John Graham and Fred Cherry.
Right. Red cherry, right.
Unbelievable piece. Do you remember
Mm.
it well?
Yeah, sure, sure. I remember there were so many page turns that I wrote out my own parts. Those were the days when you had time. I just wrote the fiddle part with, one line with the other parts as a composite. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I think I lost that part. I haven't seen it in a long time. Anyway.
Well, I find that period of Wuorinen really fascinating. You know, the Grand
Mm.
Bambula.
Mm-hmm.
And did you ever play? I want to say it, but I'm blanking. What's the piece with violin, conga, and bass with Palma on
Oh
bass?
no, I did not play that.
Spin-off.
Sorry?
Spin-off.
Yeah, I heard of it. No, I never played it. Mm.
That's a cool piece.
Right. I think by that time, you see, I left Speculum various times, and they always, prodded me back in. I think at that point, Ben Hudson was the violinist, and he lived with Charles Wuorinen, and so that's probably, my guess would be he played it a lot.
Yeah. And did you play the violin piano, Wuorinen?
I played a duo. I recorded it in Cologne, actually, duo for violin and piano. There's some other works after that that I have not played.
But those are two cool pieces, the string trio and the duo for violin and piano. I remember well.
Mm, mm. 1967. Yeah, I remember
Mm.
that.
Yeah, and you know, one of the things that was so striking to me, seeing you and seeing the early performances in the 70s of this music, which we now all kind of consider the classic contemporary music, is that you guys really you made an effort to bring it to the audience. And
Mm,
always when I watch you perform, I just think, you know, you're such a dramatic performer and such an intense performer. And it gives such a level of just engagement in this abstract music that we
mm,
don't always get a chance to receive from performers. You know, I think a big part of it is I feel as though you find the lyricism in things. You are able to dig in rhythmically in a way that it kind of communicates even a pulse in something that would be very abstract and maybe not so pulsy.
mm,
Um,
mm.
could you tell me a little bit about how you sort of arrived at that approach? Do you play this music the way you play any music, the way you play, you know, Schubert or Prokofiev or anything like that?
Yeah, sure, whatever the music requires and asks for. I mean, Schubert is less likely to be as driven rhythmically as Stravinsky, say, or Bartok. Even though Bartok has the lyricism of a Schubert. You know, late Beethoven, well, a lot of Beethoven can be very astringent, let's say, or intense. I mean, I could give you thousands of examples. I mean, for instance, the C sharp minor quartet has this violent outburst, da-da-dum, ba-da-dum, da-da-dum, ba-da-dum, ba-dum, ba-dum. You know, you just follow the music. I mean, I don't, sure, there's a certain amount of talent, but there's no golden key to how I approach it or how I do it, or you just have to learn the music according to the notes that are on the paper and find the meaning behind it. I mean, that's the key, really. And in teaching, I often find students are happy when they play the notes and they don't search further. You know.
But you
Um,
do. And that's something that fascinates me too, because when you're experiencing Webern for the first time, and you're experiencing Babbitt, and you're experiencing Warren and Stravinsky, and all this in the same sort of 10-year time period, it might be. Um, are you coming up with like how are you relating to each of these composers? Do you feel like they're communicating something that you have to get in touch with, or is it up to you to find something to engage yourself?
well, let me make one thing clear. It's very humbling to work with composers because they know very well what they wrote and how they want it played. I mean, For instance, the hardest week of my life I spent in Budapest working with the Hungarian composer Gyorgy Kurtag on his Kafka fragments, which is a fiendishly difficult four-part piece for violin and voice, I should say for voice and violin, on Kafka texts. And there's some incredible demands there. And I worked the piece up. I had it for about 3 months, I would say, playing from hand manuscript, single pages that could fall off the stand, you know. And then I traveled to Budapest, was picked up, went right to his house near the Danube, about an hour away from Budapest, and unpacked and started playing. And between the soprano, whom I'd never met before, who had premiered the piece, who knew it very well, and him, I just couldn't win. You know, I prepared very diligently, like I always do, but his expressive range was much wider than, you know, what we encountered here. Let's say Babbitt, Davidovsky, Carter, Wuorinen, and you know, it's fairly abstract, but fairly much more within bounds. Let's say the Hungarian element is, I mean, rather wilder.
Did you relate
So
that to Bartok at all?
yeah, oh, very much. I learned from Kurtak a whole lot about Bartok. You know, at one point he sat down at the piano and played me the opening of the solo violin sonata of Bartok. And the gist of it was that it's much more lyrical than how we, you know, a lot of people hammer the solo sonata of Bartok's in particular. You know, when you have these complicated quadruple chords, it's very tempting to just slash the strings, and you know what you get is a very rough sound. And no, everything has to be round.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So it's not really percussive, then it's what? Buoyant more?
Well, I mean, there are limits. You know, some of these super difficult things will always be somewhat percussive, but you have to try your damnedest to make them round and, you know, more pleasing sounding. Or, um, I mean, look, as a performer, you learn the level of respect you have for these composers. You know, I've worked with many composers who I don't respect all that much. You know, you when you first meet a composer or when you first see the piece and start working on it, you are totally open. But you soon find out, well, this is A or B or C class, you know. But what I'm getting at is somebody like Kurtak, however difficult and demanding as he was, I respect him a tremendous amount. And his place in the pantheon is pretty much secured. You know, he's really the last living composer of that generation of that stature. You know, now that Carter and um, Boulez and Ligeti and Babbitt and Davidovsky, they've all died. You know, so he's really the last one. Wuorinen died recently too. Yeah.
This past year, yeah.
Yeah.
Rolf, you're fading into darkness. Is it
Oh,
possible
okay.
you have a
Yeah, yeah.
light?
Is that better?
Yes. Okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Um, wow. Okay. Um,
And
how?
you know, since we talked about all these names, they're all very, very different. Yes, Davidovsky worked with Babbitt in the electronic studio, but temperamentally they're totally different. You know, I would say Wuorinen is very angular. You know, everything is very what the French call raisonné. It's very interesting that he loved medieval and Renaissance music the most, really.
He did.
Um, and you know, Davidovsky loved that music too. I mean, he often talked about Machaut and you know Dufay and but his music is, because of his Latin background, just that much more flamboyant. Um, I mean, we'll talk about all these individuals as we go along.
Sure.
Yeah.
But you touch on something interesting too, because you're at the forefront of the interface between electronic sounds and acoustic sounds with
Mm,
pieces like the synchronisms.
right.
And I wondered, like again, now those are sort of viewed as, I don't know, sonically at least quaint, but those are important moments because now we see all sorts of interaction between
Right.
electronic and acoustic
Mm,
instruments to very interesting results.
right.
So, what was your feeling about that music when you first performed it, and how do you feel about it now?
Well, really, the only piece with electronics that I have played and will play in the future are the two of Davidovsky's, Synchronisms number 2 and 9.
Why
It's
is
not
that?
my favorite. Well, it's not my favorite element. Number 2 is easier in that there's very little synchronization, but the number 9 is razor sharp. It's very difficult to stay with the tape. And it's like what Stravinsky said about Webern's music, which is that there are jewels that are hidden that you have to unearth. Well, in Mario's case, they're really very much in the foreground. But when you razor sharp with the tape, it's the most joyful, and it makes the whole world of difference. But it's so hard to attain that level, you know.
There's no
Um,
click.
no, no. Well, I take it back. We did, since you mentioned the click, we did a cowell piece for two flutes, violin, and viola. Um, Susan Palmer played, John Graham played the viola. I forget who the other flutist was. Probably was Paul Dunkel. We recorded it, and it was rhythmically fairly complex. So we had click tracks, and I hate that. I mean, it's not a fun experience to have a
No.
thing in your ear while you're playing, you know.
Why was that necessary?
Well, it was there were complicated rhythms. If I recall correctly, it's so long ago. There was one part in straight eighth notes, the other one in quintuplets, and then sixes again, and maybe nines, and they were independent enough so that they were very hard to coordinate. I guess you could have had a conductor, but we didn't. It was just a quartet. It was oddly called Quartet Romantic, and it was anything but. It was sort of like those Nankoro player piano studies, you know, rhythmic games that were fairly hard to execute, without the click track.
That's interesting compared to Nankoro because you're talking about a sort of machinistic accuracy.
Hmm. There is no violin music. I've never played any of his music, nor heard
Right.
it much, really.
Yeah. And Cowell's an interesting composer. You don't hear enough about him, I think.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, I mean, Ligeti gave a talk when he got the Grawemeyer Award, and I went to Merkin Hall here, and he definitely admitted that Nankara was an influence on him, polyrhythmically.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, yeah.
Huh.
There's another fascinating musical person. I recently saw a portrait. Um, I love that man from the very beginning. I mean, very artistic personality.
I know his son, Lucas.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, his
he was
drummer.
a percussionist, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so we've worked together as percussionists.
Mm,
And I
mm,
think it was in the Bay Area. It may have been some more than once, I think, in New York too.
yeah.
Yeah, Ligeti's great. He's I wonder if you could talk about the horn trio because I know you've recorded
Mm,
and played
yeah.
that piece. That's an
Yeah.
interesting piece by Ligeti.
Fantastic piece. I mean, as you get older, I once had a thought of playing music from each decade on a concert program, something from the 60s, something from the 70s, the 80s. There are two pieces in the 80s that stand out for me, and that is the horn trio of Ligeti and the waltzes of Fred Laerdal, one from 82, the other from 80. Both fantastic pieces that will stand the test of time.
Hmm.
Again, there are thousands of pieces that get played once, maybe recorded, maybe if you're lucky, played a second time, but then they're put on the shelf. But the pieces that repeatedly get played, those are the ones that will survive, and I'm more interested in those or doing my bit to make them part of that pantheon or that collection of pieces.
And the Ligeti Chamber Concerto too.
Yeah, we played that in Speculum. That ended up being, I shouldn't say a disaster, but it wasn't as fortuitous as it could have been. Wuorinen conducted it, and he didn't like the piece. That never helps. Now the individual parts are quite demanding. You know, you have I think 10 players, maybe 12, and the parts move around. And I remember we started rehearsing it, and I wrote him a letter. In those days, there was no email. You know, I didn't have a phone number, and he answered very promptly. And he said, "It's okay to cheat a little bit if you don't, you know." Because these parts were very demanding, and that's a wonderful piece. I heard that I attended Darmstadt chorus in 1970, and the piece was freshly written, and he played tapes of it.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
What was he
But the
like?
horn trio is the last movement of it is called Lament or Lamento. That's one of the darkest things you've ever heard. I don't know if you remember it. At the end, the horn goes to the lowest register, where you almost don't hear a sound anymore. It's like a Tibetan chant, if you want. And Bill Purvis, who played the part, he had learned circular breathing, which is sort of required there. And the violin is up in the stratosphere in the highest regions, you know. And the sonic effect of that is just earth-shattering, you know, or heart-piercing, I should say. That's some of the darkest music I've ever played, and I haven't played it in a long time. There is a problem with the manuscript. His manuscripts tend to be very messy. They're like scribbles, you know, on the sides of the lines. You know, there's commentary often, and the hand is not very neat to start with. And Schott finally made a printed version, but you still have way too many page turns. I guess now I haven't switched over to, you know, electronic foot pedal music stand and reading off this, you know. But
Yeah, that could be helpful.
right, it definitely would. Yeah.
Um, I did want to speak with you about Elliott Carter. You've had a
Right.
long history with his work.
Right. I mean, having said that about the decades, in the 70s, his violin and piano duo is fiendishly difficult, but what a piece. I mean, again, um, I actually heard the premiere at Boulez started the Perspective Encounters. You probably heard quite a
I
few of them
remember,
down
yeah.
at the Astor Place. What's it called? Not the New School. The hall with the columns. You know
Oh,
that
Union,
Cooper Union.
Cooper
Yeah,
Union.
and Paul Zukovsky and Gil Kalish played it, and they stood way apart to illustrate the fact that the parts were really very totally independent. In fact, there's not a single attack in the piece that is together.
Is that the plan? I guess I never realized that.
Well, I never asked Elliott whether there was a plan, but we checked it. You know, everybody that has played the piece, I remember talking with Charles Rosen about it. And indeed, there is not a single attack that ever falls together. Unlike in Wuorinen, where it happens, you know, 9 times out of 10, you know, synchronization is all over the place. And yeah, but it's a tremendous piece that is so hard that it still doesn't get played that much. But what's fascinating there is at the end, after it starts out with this monologue of the violin, which Elliott called trying to get to the top of Mount Everest. Again, very high in the register and with lots of tenths, which are very big stretches and difficult, therefore. And slowly the piano joins in. There are little interludes, little dialogues, but there comes a point toward the end where things really snap. I can't think of a similar example in all of music, where things go kind of out of control, and that's one of the most thrilling moments to go through as a performer. You know, you have to, needless to say, you have to give it your all, just physically and mentally and emotionally too. You know, it's very demanding, and then it sort of very slowly, after exploding, really, um, very gradually quiets down and ends like many Carter pieces in sort of a what the Italians call perdendosi, you know, to just sort of peter out. Um,
But I have to say, I've seen you play that piece several times.
mm,
It's probably had a huge influence on my conception of the violin and writing for the violin.
oh,
You always made it so musical, and it's almost like a solo sonata with piano accompaniment. And
mm,
I've always been interested in how the you change roles with the piano. So
mm,
when you go from being less active to being more sustained sounds, the piano starts kicking up. And then it
mm,
seems like to me, like at the end, what you're talking about is everything starts to really get unhinged.
right. Well, at the end, the violin takes over. The piano just sort of plays individual, very harsh attacks. Um, uh, and at the opening, the violin pretty much plays a long recitative, you know. What I've learned, this is kind of shop talk, but I played a piece from score, um, is basically I follow the piano. I know the piano part quite well, and I still set, you know, the exclamation points. And I mean, I play. I would say it's a violin centric piece. It's, let's say, 2/3 in favor of the violin to the piano, which is different from Beethoven sonatas or even the Stravinsky Duo Concertante, where it's even. Um, but the secret is in ensemble, in coordinating the two parts, is that if you're aware of what the piano does, you can play around and with it. Um, if the pianist tries to follow the violin, that doesn't work in this piece. Um, it's been my experience.
So it is you are in effect making the independence thing happen.
Yeah. Well, all of Elliott's music, you know, for instance, the second string quartet, he has these duos within the quartet. There's always one part playing off the other, contesting. I mean, at one point he said this about his quartets, that there are civilized dialogues between cultured individuals, but an argument is not forbidden. I mean, they can have disagreements too. So, and then of course I've played. By now, I've played and recorded the Violin Concerto, which the middle movement of that is very similar to the double concerto, which you probably know better than the Violin Concerto because it was sort of a seminal piece. It got the Pulitzer Prize, and in that you have the two groups that play independently, and they were conductors. I remember, I think Jerry Schwartz was one of them that could conduct one rhythm with one hand and another one with the left hand. In the violin concerto, the violinist is basically on his own against the orchestra. Let me try to remember. It's in 6/4. The orchestra plays in 4/4, and the violin in 6/4. So, since you're less likely to encounter a conductor who will give you both independent beatings with each hand, you're totally on your own, and that's quite difficult. And yet, at the same time, of the three composers, or let's say the four, and I might add, I want to add a fifth one, and that is Donald Martino, with whom I worked very intensely. I think he is one of our best composers, too. Unfortunately, no longer with us now for 15 years. Um, Again, totally different from the others, but the rhythmic independence of a Carter is really his signature. You know, the rhythmic conversions, the polyrhythms. I've played solo pieces of his too. Even there, you know, the most famous of them, Riconoscenza for Goffredo Petracci, there are these three elements too, in a much sparser way, of course, as a solo violin piece. He always has two, three, sometimes four ideas all working against each other. And oh, I momentarily lost my train of thought. He has probably the most elegant rhythm of these four composers, or five. Martino would be a close second. And I think he learned that from Nadia Boulanger, in that he lived in France. I think of Elliott's music as kind of French.
Do you?
Yeah, the rhythms, they float. They're very elegant. They're sort of effortlessly trying to come up with the right verb. They float. You know,
Sort
he
of
has,
natural phraseology.
yeah, he has 15 16s, and of course Wuorinen has them at times too, but they are always more measured, more, you know. But with him, with Elliott, there's this natural elegance that I really love. And in the duo, you know, the piano part, for instance, the ripples would be a good word to describe them. You know.
Do you feel as though he really favored the violin? There's so much violin music from Mr. Carter.
Well, he was a pianist by training. He also played the oboe, I think I read and heard somewhere. But I've never heard him play. So he was not an active performer. He, I wouldn't say he was a natural for the violin. He knew all instruments quite well. I think in the duo, there's a funny story. You know, it's dedicated to his wife. It says to Helen, whom I knew quite well. I mean, we used to be over there for dinners often, and he really had sort of a salon almost, where he invited other very interesting musicians. I remember I met Holliger there, and Charles Rosen, and Boulez, and many, many others. Yeah, remind me, what was
Boulez was a big fan of Mr. Carter.
right? Well, he played his music a lot.
I saw the premiere when he came back. He conducted the Philharmonic for Triple Duo, wasn't that, or Penthode? I can't remember which one it was. But
Penfold was written for his ensemble, so my guess would be it would have been that.
and
I
then it was
played
on the
both of
program with Ligeti.
the Kammerkonzert or the
Yeah,
Chamberkonzert. Okay,
and I
yeah.
saw Mr. Carter in the audience,
Mm-hmm.
and I went up to him, and he was not into the Ligeti.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
and I always thought that was so funny. Like he'd tell some kid, oh, that I can't, simple-minded claptrap or something like. It was really old school. It was an old school composer dig, and I
Mm.
thought, oh, well, I mean, at that age, I don't know if I really understood the difference between Carter and Ligeti, but it sort of keyed me into this fact that, like, within the abstract world of music, there was taste and very considered
Uh,
opinions about what was cool and what was hip and what was not.
yeah. Well, these things, they're very delicate. We don't know well, we do know a little bit what Beethoven liked. For instance, he liked Handel, which is a little bit odd, but you know, he certainly respected and knew Haydn. He studied with Haydn and Mozart, of course. But with Elliott, I know pretty much what he liked. For instance, he did not like Schoenberg or the whole Viennese school.
I wanted to ask you, yeah, what did he say?
That comes from Boulanger. In fact, in my opinion, a lot of his tastes come from her. he often quoted that she said, "Oh, Lulu gives me a headache." You know, it's neither here nor there, the statement itself, but in fact, both she and Elliott, I believe, were not too favorably inclined toward German music, except Bach. But even Beethoven and Brahms, I mean, I remember I once translated an interview with Elliott in Germany, and he was asked, "Do you like Brahms?" He said, "No, it's too sad for me." You know, yeah. But to each his own. I mean, we have to respect what they like and what they don't. I mean, Elliott, for instance, he didn't know Davidovsky's music that much, but he heard me play the Synchronisms number 9 once or several times. And the story goes that he was at a concert at Columbia, I believe, where Davidovsky's music was being played for the whole evening. And he turned around, Mario was sitting behind him, and he asked him, "Has your music been recorded?" And he said, "No, not this particular music that was being played." And I understand that Elliott, who was financially fairly independent, financed a whole album of Davidovsky's music. And this generosity goes all the way back to in the early 50s. There was a concert at the Y, I believe, that the Juilliard Quartet and Jacques Monod with Bethany Beardsley put on of Webern's music, and Elliott contributed financially toward that. So there was this generosity that I really appreciated, and toward us performers too. You know, he sometimes funneled money through the Fromm Foundation to assist us. In fact, I own a set of tales that Helen Carter financed. Um, yeah, and they did the same for Charles Rosen, I understand. Yeah.
Well, it recalls Mr. Charles Ives doing that, and the League of
Hmm.
Composers going back to Varese, and of course, Elliott Carter would have been aware of that. He would have
Hmm.
experienced that,
Possibly,
and
yeah.
Ives was very supportive of Elliott Carter.
Hmm. Hmm. I didn't know that Ives was generous toward musicians that played his music. Or,
Yeah,
hmm.
he was supportive of different choral groups that Varese was putting together, and and was doing it coast to coast. I mean, he was literally anybody that was trying to do new music, and then of course he would uh, pay for concerts. He paid to
Mhm.
paid legal fees for some musicians when they had issues. So it's great to hear that Elliott Carter carried that on.
Mhm, mhm. Well, you know, a lot of composers are starving; they can't afford to do it. Or, but he definitely, yeah. He also, I mean, the story goes, I got to know Russell Sherman, excellent pianist, who in his day did a lot for new music. He lived here in New York, went to Juilliard, studied with Steuermann, who was, of course, Schoenberg's pianist. He always had an ear and an eye open to new music, but he approached Elliott for a piano piece, and Elliott said, "Generally, I only compose for performers who play my music already." So he turned down the offer. Um, that's interesting, you know. I mean, for instance, there's a group of a handful, really, of players of Elliott's duo. You know, Zukovsky played it, who is alas no longer with us. I myself, there's a Norwegian violinist, a friend of mine, Ole Bøhn. I don't know if you know the name. They
No,
say Ule is the way you pronounce it. A few others, but it's really a small circle, and we sometimes commiserate about the technical difficulties. There's a passage in the middle where you have to play double harmonics. They're so high, A, you can't really hear them, or B, they sometimes don't speak. You know, it's treacherously difficult. I mean, we all pray when we get to that section. There's two pages in the score in which the violin only plays double harmonics. And the piano doesn't help much. The piano is way in the low register, you know, makes very little sound. So you're all exposed. Yeah.
do you feel as though his writing, because I know you were a big part of the last works and you played those, uh, do you feel like his writing evolved to be more or less difficult over time?
Definitely less. Partly, I mean, maybe I shouldn't shop talk, but I did hear that James Levine. It's interesting. Not only Boulez, who's always been an advocate of Boulez's, of Carter's, um, then Barenboim and James Levine started conducting his music, and I heard that Levine asked for Carter's music to be written only in 4/4. Yes, the music got a little more, let's say, simplified. But
Oh,
then
so that,
again, there are these terrific, complex pieces like the huge symphony that Ollie Nusson recorded with a Latin title, Omnia Pleni Sunt, something like that. I can't quote the complete title. But I practically knew Elliott until the day that he died. He wrote some smaller pieces at the end, the piano trio that we played at Juilliard, that really was left fragmentary, and somebody finished it. And I don't think that's really first-rate Carter. There was a string trio also, short piece, not A1 quality.
the
However, up
epigrams?
until the 2010s, let's say, or nine, it he was always very inventive. For instance, you mentioned the triple duo before. At the end, he wrote a piece just to humor himself called Double Trio. For the oddest instrumentation, there was a clarinet, there was a cello, there was the odd pairing of a violin and a trombone as one of the trios. And it's a very attractive piece, much gentler and much smaller and much less. I mean, the triple duo is a pretty die-hard, huge percussion parts. Um, you know,
How about the epigrams?
the epigrams. I don't know that piece.
Oh,
Um,
it's
for what?
it's
For
violin, cello, and piano,
oh,
and
that's the
it's
piano trio. That's the piano trio I was just talking about. Yeah,
yeah,
his very last piece.
yeah.
Right. Yeah, it comes back now. That's the piece I don't think should really be performed. It wasn't finished. Somebody, I mean, I know Fred helped. Um, Ted Edwards, do you know that name? He was basically his editor.
Oh,
He had his hands in there, but there are some things that are not first rate. I wouldn't push for that piece being performed.
well, why do you say that? Because I'm curious how you sense a difference between those that period and the earlier.
Well, there's one movement in which some very awkward quadruple stops for the violin appear, and you can't. If Elliott, if I had the chance to work with Elliott on them, we would have found a different solution. Um, and look, the man was 100 and some years old by then. He was sharp as a nail mentally, but you know, the powers uh, left him a little bit toward the end. Even the string trio, which is from a year before or two, it was played at the Y. There was a big birthday concert. I forget the year, maybe 2000, maybe it was 2009, 10.
The 100th anniversary?
Yeah, it was a big deal, big, huge concert with a lot of music and a lot of it new. And you have to admire somebody that age still being able to compose. But they were all short up. I remember there was a solo bassoon piece, which was very witty, incredibly well played by somebody named Kolkai, a wonderful player who now plays in the Chamber Society. But they were all smaller little essays.
I feel like I appreciate that about a composer not trying to overwrite. And
Right.
it's very
Right.
funny because I just watched a 1.5 or 2 minute interview from the 80s Feldman, Elliott Carter, and Ursula sitting
Oh,
around in Buffalo. It's
uh-huh,
on YouTube. I can
uh-huh.
send you the link. And
And Fred Jeffrey wasn't part of it by any chance?
no, it's
No.
literally those three with I think a couple of students around. And they're talking about durations of pieces and Feldman saying we need an hour and a half of music, and Elliott saying, well, what about 20 minutes of music? And he's saying, well, you can't, everyone shouldn't write 20-minute pieces, says Feldman. And then Carter says, well, you know, if you don't play an hour, it's the same thing if no one plays it for an hour and a half or 20 minutes, it's still not
Mm-hmm.
getting played. So it was
Yeah.
interesting to kind of look at the fact that he said it was harder to write a short piece than it was to write a longer piece.
Mm. Well,
So I'll definitely.
composers are full of contradictions. I mean, all these earlier pieces that I played of Feldman's were all very short. And toward the end of his life, he got this crazy idea of writing. I mean, think of the physicality. There's a string quartet that lasts, what, 3 hours? 5
5 hours.
hours? Yeah. I mean, how can anybody? I know it's not very intense music. It's mostly just, he asks you often not to play with vibrato, without vibrato. And the dynamics are all very soft. But still, it's strenuous just to hold up your instrument, for that many hours. And maybe, you might need a little sustenance, in 5 hours, a little water or something. It's impractical to write that length of music.
I,
How
I
did Elliott and Feldman interact? I mean, was there mutual respect or the lack thereof? Or
no, it seemed fine.
Hmm.
It was interesting for me because I do think of them as being very different, but also they're contemporaries in a way. So I
Mhm.
mean, Feldman being younger, but Elliott did not sort of put up with Feldman's pronouncements about what we must be doing because he said, "What do you mean by we?"
So I get the drift. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Now, I'm fascinated by the idea of you working on a piece with Elliott Carter. What kind of feedback would you get regarding any of the things you're dealing with while you're playing that piece?
Right. Well, I do remember working on the duo. He came to Ursula's apartment. We had just learned it. Um, we'd gone through it. It was tremendously difficult, and we were both exhausted. And I remember Elliot, who was sort of charming in a very innocent and naive way, almost naive way. He asked very gently, "Well, could I hear it again?" And we were exhausted, so of course, we did. And but basically, from a certain point on, he just trusted us. I do remember the last piece that he wrote for me, the fantasy, remembering Roger, that being Sessions. I came to his house and played it for him, and I remember one spot I had misread an ottava sign, and I played something down an octave, and he got actually very angry. He said, "No, up an octave." But other than that, we had he just trusted me and all of us really, Fred, Ursula, um, and that's a wonderful thing. Um, and likewise, we actually haven't talked about Milton at all. Milton was, of all these composers, the one who didn't even want to be bothered talking about his piece. I remember him saying to me, "Oh, you know how it goes. You do it." That was his attitude, you know. Um,
But
and
I have to tell you, Rolf, I have to
yeah,
tell you,
yeah.
I'm lucky enough to have been around when these guys were sitting in the audience, as I mentioned to you about Mr. Carter. So I'm sitting behind Mr. Babbitt and his wife,
Yeah,
and
Sylvia.
yeah, and I think it was all set for jazz ensemble, or it might have been another chamber piece. And he literally said, and I'm paraphrasing, but he literally was concerned this way. He said, well, the cellist played about 87% of the notes correctly, and the violinist played about 92% of the notes correctly. And he was running it down like that for her. And of course, I'm a student in the back overhearing this, and I'm thinking, this guy, wow, is
Well,
he serious? And he was serious, you know.
uh-huh, uh-huh. Well, it shows the brilliant mind of the man. I mean, the just to separate individual voices. Let me say, as a performer, 87%, 92%, that's pretty good. I remember I once played the Wuorinen Trio in Brooklyn with the violist, and this was right at the time of the World Series that the Mets won in 1986. So between the violist and I, we were talking about these games. And after the performance, he asked me, well, what kind of batting average did I get? And I said to him about maybe 265, which, which isn't very high, right?
No.
I mean, it's not bad, but it's not great either. And I mean, that shows how critical I am with myself and you know my colleagues in a given performance. But really, 87% is not bad. 92, that's pretty damn good.
So
Um,
is that something that talk to me a little bit about the difference between performing those Babbitt pieces and like the Joy of Sextets or that you did with Alan
right.
Feinberg, and then Elliott Carter's music.
Well, again, they're totally different. They're both well. The duo of Elliott's is equally difficult. The piece that's the Joy of Sextets refers to an older piece called Sextet that I played with Robert Miller, who was then the champion of piano new music in New York, let's say.
And
There were a few others.
he also commissioned Night Fantasies partially, right? One of the
No, he was not one of the four. That was Charles Rosen, Gil Kalish, Ursula, and who was the fourth?
Paul Jacobs.
Paul Jacobs, exactly.
Okay.
No, Robert Miller. He always wanted to play Carter, but maybe because of the same reason as I mentioned before with Russell Sherman, maybe he was kept out of the loop because he hadn't played Elliott's music otherwise. I'm sure he played the double concerto and the ensemble pieces, but for some reason he wanted to play the duo with me. We never got to do that. Um, anyway, we were talking about Babbitt and Miller. Yeah, the sextets. Speaking of, that's probably the single hardest piece I played ensemble wise. Um, and when I look back on all my recordings, that's in many ways the proudest I should be because it's so damn hard. I mean, you have, for starters, dynamics from 5 Fs to 5 Ps and everything in between. Every note has a dynamic. And now the rhythms are divided by not only triplets and quintuplets, but sevens, nines, 11s, I think even 13s, and partials thereof. So the ensemble is very intricate. And I remember I was living very close to Robert Miller at the time, both on West End Avenue, and we met every day, 5 days a week for about a month. And I think the performance was pretty good for the group for contemporary music. And then years later, I recorded it with Alan Feinberg, and that I think it turned out very well too. I mean, there too, I went up to Alan's place almost every day, and I remember he used to make a very strong cup of coffee before we even started to get through this. Yeah. Compared with that, the joy of sextets is a walk in the park. It's a longer piece, but infinitely easier. But
It's a
again,
great
you asked me,
recording. That's a great
yeah,
recording of you and Feinberg playing them
hmm
both, and I
yeah,
listened to it, and I actually some of my favorite Babbitt,
mm. The joy or the sextet
the
or both.
sextets, but both
Sextet.
really, because
Yeah.
I like that I can handle Babbitt in duo. It
Uh-huh.
gets harder for me, as it goes into larger numbers of ensemble.
Mm. Well, there too. I mean, I remember being on a concert where we played a super difficult piece of his called "The Head of the Bed,"
Yeah.
a piece that however, as difficult as it is, I think is first of all has a wonderful poem. of the most complex kind by John Holland. That in itself takes, a long time of study. And on the program was, I now compare this to Elliott's later music. By the way, the two of them were really old friends and respected each other. Both, Milton respected Elliott and vice versa. There was no animosity, no envy, no jealousy. That's kind of nice to see.
Absolutely. I'm curious though. Wouldn't you say Babbitt was more of a post Schoenberg Webern guy
Oh,
than
yeah,
Carter?
they came from different camps for
Yeah,
sure. I mean, Elliott was in the Stravinsky camp, and
of course.
Debussy. Again, the French music that I talked about before with Elliott. Whereas, yeah, Babbitt was in the Schoenberg, Webern. You know, Babbitt was at a certain point at every concert that I played. You could count on seeing him in the
He
audience.
went to the
And
concerts, I remember. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, Mario Davidovsky, you had to sometimes beg him to come to pieces when his own music was being played, you know. Um, yeah. I mean, that alone, the enthusiasm that Milton had for all kinds of new music. He was also very helpful. For years, I went to a place called the Composers Conference,
Yeah.
first at a college up in northern Vermont, and then later at Wellesley College. And I saw Babbitt work with younger composers, and the patience and the care that he showed, and helping young composers find their way. He would make gentle suggestions of how to improve things, and that was very touching to see, and very important, I think, for the younger generation.
So was he demanding rhythmically? I mean, when you say you know how it goes, he would say that, but
he
I'm
would
curious.
he would totally stay out of it. Of course, with Babbitt, it's if you're not at a certain level, you better not even try.
Right.
I mean, you have to know your rhythm palette, shall we say, and your pitch and your dynamic palette. Even though, if I may say so, I hear lots of performances in which the dynamics aren't being observed of Babbitt's music, and to me, that's a big stylistic element. These things really have to pop off, the loud ones as much as the little soft ones. I mean, it comes from the ease of electronic music, in which you just push buttons and you create these sonorities.
Dynamics are always the last thing, though. You can see that people
Yeah.
don't get to that level and then they go out and play it.
Well, to me, they're very, very important. I mean, the whole spectrum. Again, I hear many performances where you have a spectrum of mezzo forte to mezzo piano. It's very unsatisfying to my ear. It has to be much wider. Um, I mean, that's you asked me before what my secret might be, but you have to really stretch yourself as far, almost like a rubber band before it explodes. Um, it reminds me of Pablo Casals talking about cello strings sounding the best right before they pop. Of course, you don't want to take that chance on stage, but speaking of cellists, I played a few performances with Joel Krosnick from the Juilliard Quartet, and he was such an intense player that you could almost count on him breaking a string in each performance.
Wow, really?
Yeah, yeah. Anyway,
How do you coach or teach Babbitt or Carter to young people?
when it comes up, I mean, yeah. I once, the Brentano Quartet asked me once to have them to listen to their. They were struggling still with the sixth string quartet. I haven't coached Babbitt that much, but anybody is welcome to come knock on my door. Carter, I've coached a bit more, or taught. You
What do
know.
you find that you're saying when you're communicating about those works?
Well, as with all music, you try to get the sweep, the aesthetic, the style, of the individual composer. Again, you find that players don't challenge themselves enough. I mean, for me, it has to be a total immersion in the style at the moment. Of course, you have to switch back. Somebody once said, I think it was Bernstein, that a performer has to be an actor, i.e., you have to slip into these various roles. Um, you know, I mean, even Mozart is not this genteel thing. You have to probe and go for the moments where he, goes very deep. I mean, just yesterday I heard the D minor piano concerto. That's for Mozart as demonic and dark as it gets. You know, um, I mean, Schumann, for instance, often isn't played crazily enough. You know,
That's an interesting point because I think that people have sort of this preconception about politeness in certain forms of chamber music.
yeah.
And I
None of
always,
these guys were polite. I mean, Beethoven was famous for his outbursts. Brahms had a very acid tongue. I interrupt you. Sorry.
well, just that I noticed that you're willing to go as a performer really hard on the
Mhm.
instrument.
Yeah.
Um, and I think that that's something that really comes across because you have extremes of volume, but when you go hard, it really means something. It has
Hmm.
an impact, and it
And
also communicates. I think that this is an intense moment of the piece. This we're getting a sense of form. We're getting a sense of stretch, of duration, of arrival.
mhm.
That's something that I've always appreciated about how you perform, and that's very instructive to people coming up like myself, where we'd say like, no, you really have to get into this. If you're going to
Mhm.
play this music convincingly, you have to throw down.
Right. Right.
And I think that a lot of people are, that they don't get on the level of that you do in terms of, as you say, preparing, really thinking about it, looking at it, and then throwing yourself into it the way that you do.
I'm not going to compare myself with other people, but you mentioned the word polite, and I find many performances of some big names, you know, polished is another word that I'm very allergic to. You know, when you step out on stage, it's not about showing how well you can play your instrument. It's about bringing the music across. And the music sometimes can be pretty chaotic, you know, or pretty anguished or frustrated even, you know. I mean, I remember as a kid, I used to, right before going on stage, read about a composer in books that I had at home, about their personal lives. And then, this is pretty adolescent, really, but it sort of stayed with me that you, I've seen a few composers at work at their tables, with their pencils and their music paper. Um, you try to put yourself in the head of what was in this guy's mind when he wrote this piece, whatever it may be, gentle or lyrical or aggressive or, you know. I mean, for instance, in this portrait of Ligetis the other day, he was talking about his background, his, tremendously difficult period during the war, where his family was wiped out, and he admitted later on during this interview that a certain aggressiveness stayed with him. And I find a lot of people would paint over that and deny it or not talk about it, but it's there.
Oh, it's important.
And
And, think about what Xenakis went through. And
mm,
that shows up in his music. It's
yeah,
explosive, it's violent.
right.
And I always, even as a student, and I still do today, though, I love to read about composers and what they were going through when they were writing pieces. I must know. To
Yeah.
have any sort of real appreciation of for me, a true depth of appreciation for what that is about. I mean, I can go on my own. I can come up with my own narrative for things, but when I listen to Prokofiev or I listen to the Russian composers and I think, what the hell were these guys coping with
Mm.
to try to play, to make this music happen
Right.
when they were being, harassed for even trying to write it. The Shostakovich stories alone,
Right. Right. Right.
you know.
Yeah. Of
That's why I
course.
like asking you these questions, Rolf,
Yeah. Yeah.
because,
Oh,
I
yeah.
want to know what these composers, that all the books haven't been written yet on some of these guys.
Mhm. Of course, there. I hate the term, but there are many ways to skin a cat. I mean, Bach in particular can lend itself to many, many different interpretations. But yeah, I would think that having worked with Carter and Davidovsky and Babbitt and Martino and Wuorinen and many, many others, Lerdow, for instance, yeah, I mean, Balanchine used to say all his dancers were supposed to carry on the legacy, i.e., to teach once he was gone, and they do. They're all, Suzanne Farrell gets called in to teach, to coach Tzigane, for instance, or any of the ballets that were tailored to her, choreographed for her, and many of the others, to this day. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so great that you're carrying this on. What are you up to these days,
Oh,
musically?
these days I do decidedly less new music. I come back to, I just have too much fun playing Beethoven and Schumann and Brahms and Schubert and here and there something comes up. I mean, I still go back to Schoenberg, of course. I was honored to get a recital at the Institute in Vienna where I played the Fantasy, and I got to look at the manuscript again.
Oh, is it there?
Yeah, and it turns out the title, even though it's published as Fantasy, really says Fantasia. A minor point, but there it is. In capital letters, and yeah, I mean, it's most of these composers that I worked with have died, and the younger generation. It used to be people used to call me up and knock on my door. That hasn't happened in a long time. So
And where are you teaching now?
at CUNY Graduate Center,
Oh,
but even there, it's not very much. I mean, yeah,
what
I'm
pieces?
basically a performer. I mean, like anybody that knocks on my door, I'll listen to them. I'll give them my 2 cents and give them advice, whatever. But I still, knock on wood. As long as I can do it, I'll perform with a vengeance too. Yeah.
I hope so. I hope I can get to see you play the Carter Duo again.
Oh yeah. In fact, I'm peddling really. I haven't found a company, but I have one performance. I recorded it with Marty Goldray for Bridge, but I also have a performance from the radio in Bremen with Ursula, and I'm trying to find a label that'll put it out. It's all ready to go, along with a lovely early nocturne of Cages that we recorded
Oh, neat.
at the same time. And then I want to record these two, that has to yet be done, two Martino solo pieces, Fantasy Variations and Romanza that he wrote for me. Yeah.
I have very fond memories of you and Ursula playing the Carter Duo, and then I think you also did the Reconnaissance at Vassar. And
Oh,
I
oh
remember,
yeah.
right?
Richard Wilson put that together.
And Julius Hemphill was sitting a few rows ahead of us, and I remember saying to my wife, "That's Hemphill. That's the jazz saxophonist. He's very important." And when I spoke with Ursula for her oral history interview for Yale, we spoke a lot about Julius, and she remembered that concert also. And
Mhm.
you know,
You know what I remember about that day? He
hmm,
came up to me afterwards and he said, I didn't know you did breakdancing too. Because that piece is so, you need the last ounces of your physical energy. And sometimes, your legs stomping your foot sometimes helps. So I remember that comment right
yeah,
after the performance. Yeah.
yeah. Well, you're a very very physical performer, and that's
Yeah.
something that's
Yeah.
very exciting, I think. So, Rolf, I want to thank you for taking the time to chat. This has been a blast.
Sure, sure. Likewise. It's good to reminisce about the old days.
But there's just so much great history there, and so
Yeah.
much of my favorite music resides there.
Mm, mm.
So thank you
Right.
again. Thank you
Sure.
everybody for listening. My guest has been violinist Rolf Schulte, one of the greats of contemporary classical. And I love hearing him play, and I'm loving hearing him talk today. So thank you for
Sure.
listening, and
Sure.
we'll see you next time on the podcast, everybody. Bye bye.